if you were to take away the character skill for every single Nightfarer, how much worse would they end up being? And that discrepancy right there is what is going to determine the criteria for this video, because it is very hard to distinguish all these skills and rank them from worst to best when they all behave very differently, and especially in a video that's going to take into account both solo play and multiplayer use. So the way I like to look at it is how much better do these characters end up being with these skills. Now, if you don't know, the character skills does not include things like the passive ability or the ultimate ability. Those are covered in separate videos. So whatever action or attack is tied behind the character skill button, those are the things that we're going to touch on today. Starting off at the bottom, we have the Executor skill, Cursed Sword, or Suncatcher, however you want to call it. Both terms are correct. Now, my opinions on this skill have not changed since I talked about this when I had the early access before the game came out. I'm pretty much going to say the exact same things. Like, deflecting in this game was never going to be as good as it was in Elden Ring, and definitely not as good as it was in Sekiro. Because to really benefit off deflecting, you have to be fighting smaller enemies that attack really quickly, so you can get lots of deflects off. Which is why when you play a game like Sekiro, there's a lot of enemies that fit that description. And when you fight those really large bosses in Sekiro that swing slowly, people tend to have problems with them because they can't just spam L1 the entire time and just win. And in a multiplayer game like this, there's going to be lots of larger bosses to compensate for the 3-player format. And these larger bosses tend to swing slower, so you're getting less deflects off. They're going to knock you back further, so you're actually not going to be in range to punish with a guard counter. And there's also going to be a lot more AoEs, which are also going to be pretty hard to block. And compared to Elden Ring's deflecting with the deflecting hard tier, that was always going to be better as well, because you could actually have this paired alongside any weapon in the game. And if you're going with any type of blocking or deflecting build in Elden Ring, it is optimal to be building around a guard countering build, because guard counters are one of the most powerful playstyles in this game and in that one, due to them pretty much outputting charged heavy attack types of damage and stance damage in a faster animation. And the deflecting hard tier pretty much made you do like double damage and like 50% more stance damage on any given guard counter. And when paired alongside larger types of weapons, they could be utterly broken, because yeah, when you have a guard counter with a large weapon, it's not even going to be that much slower, if at all, compared to a smaller weapon like a katana. And then when taking all of that and incorporating this into a multiplayer game where enemies and bosses are going to be taking their aggro between you and your allies, you're not going to have as many opportunities to be able to block or deflect enemies at all. So inherently, it's just always going to be very niche. It's obviously going to perform a lot better in solo play, where you're always going to have the enemy aggro, and where enemies have less poise, you actually can take advantage of the stance damage that the deflecting does and the stance damage that the guard counter does. Because yeah, with every single deflect, you do roughly around about like a light attack's worth of stance damage. And when you're deflecting entire combos and you ended off with a guard counter, you could definitely stance break enemies extremely quickly. And another good thing about this stance is that it does consume a lot less stamina than anything else in the game. Like, things in this game consume a lot of stamina, and when you're in this stance, you can pretty much just swing your katana forever. Now, also another downside of this stance is that it forces you to slow walk the entire time, which can be a downside, but you actually can pair this alongside the slow walking buffs, and therefore you can actually gain some passive damage over time while having this good defensive ability in just the deflecting and the high stance damage and the guard countering options, and it can combo in pretty nicely. There is also the ability to actually have this weapon buffed when you do deflect roughly 4 or 5 times. Now, when you do have this golden buff on the katana, it doesn't boost the damage at all, but it does let this katana have its own specific skill that can lunge in pretty far, get some very good hyper armor, do some decent damage. The stance damage really isn't that good for some reason, I don't really know why. But yeah, the biggest downside of this particular skill is that the katana doesn't really get that good of damage, nor does it get bleed. Like, any single blue or purple katana can pretty much outdamage this skill katana while actually getting a status effect, which is pretty much the entire thing when it comes to this character. He gets an S scaling in dexterity and in arcane. He's benefiting so much of status effects and his main character skill, and the katana doesn't get one. Like, yes, even though you can incorporate the cool tech where you can deflect at the start of the animation when you bring out the sword, or where you sheath the sword, it can be pretty cool. But for the most part, when you're deflecting, you're going to want to end in a guard counter anyway. And then once you get the stance break, then you can switch back to your main weapon. So this whole like sheathing the weapon to get the deflect isn't really going to be that useful anyway. Like, at best, this serves as a nice counter to those really quick enemies with shorter openings, like a Banished Knight or a Crucible Knight. And also it does do pretty well defensively when you're trying to like deflect or block those harder hitting boss combos or those big AoEs. But the fact that stance damage is not the same as doing partial damage in Sekiro, and the fact that you can just melt enemies way faster without using the skill, it's going to make this thing very niche. At 7, we have Claw Shot, the skill for the Wilder, and this one kind of hurts to put it lower on the list. Like, it still is going to get to the A tier with how fun and convenient it can be, but honestly, how much better is the Wilder with this particular skill compared to the rest of his kit? Like, yes, it does help you get from A to B really quickly, and if you're clearing out camps and enemies quicker, you're going to be getting more runes and more levels. It can be used as like somewhat of like a pseudo projectile attack to like lunge in towards enemies or have enemies come towards you or hit these enemies that are flying in the air. It can also help you like dodge these big massive nuke attacks that these Night Lord bosses do sometimes. Like, it definitely is very handy, and you're going to be using this a whole bunch throughout every expedition. And it can become a core part of your playstyle as well if you do pair this alongside the relic ability that buffs your greatsword after using the skill and the light attack. It will do this pretty high damaging fire attack that will buff the weapon with more fire damage, and being that this is included as a skill attack, it's not going to consume any stamina at all. Now, this is pretty limiting because you're forced to pair this alongside a greatsword, but thankfully a lot of the greatsword options that you get with the Wilder are very good, so it's not that big of a downside. So overall, it can be very solid, it's nice and fun to use, but it's not really that powerful compared to some of the other character skill in the games where it pretty much makes or breaks the character. Number 6, we have the Guardian skill, Whirlwind. Now, this one also hurts to put it lower on the list because it doesn't do anything wrong at all, and in fact, it actually complements the Guardian perfectly because his passive ability is kind of meant for those 1v1 fights and help for tanking. His ultimate ability is good for support, and his character skill is like amazing for crowd control and just killing out these trash mobs really quickly. Like, there isn't a skill in the entire game that can do crowd control as well as the Guardian skill can. Like, any single time you walk into a room, just use the skill, they all get yeeted up into the air, you can follow up with your big charged heavy attack, which is a nice horizontal swipe, and then kill them all in an instant. And then better yet, there is a relic that makes this continuously spin over and over again. This will actually result in about 20% more damage if enemies or bosses stand inside of their whirlwinds the entire time. But the most important factor of this is that the enemies will get continuously stun locked, especially those larger enemies like Banished Knights, because typically if you use the skill without the relic against the Banished Knight, it's just going to stagger them once, but with this relic ability, that is going to continuously get trapped over and over again. And it's such a nice luxury to have, and it can complement your own character's kit, and it can make your teammates' lives a lot easier as well. But like, the only reason why I'm not going to put it higher is because when you're fighting these larger bosses that cannot be staggered, or any type of like Night Lord boss, it's pretty much just useless. Like, you can pair the continuous whirlwind alongside the stamina recovery relic and gain some stamina back with every single hit just passively over time, because yeah, skills don't consume any stamina, so it is just like a net positive. And you do get some hype armor throughout that animation as well, but there really isn't too much going on with this particular skill that makes it useful for those encounters. I kind of wish it just had one other thing going for it. My suggestion would have been to give it like some iframes when you use the skill. It would have been nice. I feel like it does need at least one more thing to really make it top tier, but there really isn't much else bad I can say about it. As number 5, we have the Recluse skill, Cocktail Mix. Now, this skill is extremely hard to rank for multiple reasons. One, its passive ability is kind of intertwined with the skill, and in this video, we're just talking about character skills, not talking about passives. And yeah, the Recluse passive ability is what helps her get her FP back every single time she uses the skill. So yeah, for this particular video, we're just going to separate that one in the meantime. But also this particular Cocktail Mix, I think is just borderline useless when it comes to solo play, but in teams, it can actually be really good. I kind of feel that way about the Recluse as a whole in general, and the character skill is a big part of that, because most of the cocktail mixes you will end up getting have these really long animations, and the damage for the most part isn't much better than just using regular spells. Now obviously it's not going to consume any FP, so there is a major benefit, but with how much less health enemies have in solo play, if you have the correct relic abilities and if you stack up on a couple of starlight shards, there really isn't much of a need to save on FP. But when you do get those very like specific combinations of cocktail mixes, they can actually output a lot of damage. Now the thing is, the cocktail mixes that end up doing the most amount of damage will end up being those cocktail mixes that incorporate 3 different elements, and in solo play, it's pretty suboptimal to trying to use 3 different elements and switch back and forth between your different saves or seals or weapons, and then absorb all those elements, and then go ahead and use this attack that has a really long animation. Like if you are setting it up before like you go into a boss fight, and you can make sure you have this hard-hitting attack at the start of the fight, then yeah, it can be pretty good for those situations. But for the most part, I only really would care about it in multiplayer, because there is a lot more elements going around, and you don't have to be carrying all the elements yourself just to be able to get the combinations. Like if you have one teammate that's using holy damage, it makes your life so much easier, because there are lots of really good holy types of combinations, like the Ice Blizzard one, the one that can give you infinite FP, the one that can debuff enemies to make them have less health. And in that instance, you only really need to carry a couple of elements just to benefit off these really amazing and powerful skills. And the fact that these things have longer animations is much less of a downside in multiplayer because all your other allies are going to be taking the aggro for you. But the thing is, it's still not going to be perfect in multiplayer because it's extremely unpredictable and very RNG heavy. You can't guarantee that your teammates are always going to have a lot of different types of elements, and you also can't guarantee which ones you end up absorbing as well. Like there's been plenty of times where I've played the Recluse and I try to hit them with a particular enemy and absorb it straight away, but my teammates quickly went ahead and hit him with a different element, and then I absorbed the wrong thing. And for some reason, you can't like empty your cocktail or remove a particular one so you can like fine tune as to which combinations that you want. Like if there was one thing to be changed about this particular skill, is just to have some more like autonomy or control over the skill itself and what combinations that you get, because it feels way too random and luck based and very heavily incentivizes communication. So if you're playing with randoms, it's pretty much just like an impossible task. So I don't really know how they would do it exactly, but just having a way to where we can guarantee the element that we want sometimes, or being able to remove certain affinities from our cocktail mix, I think that would be pretty cool. Number 4, we have the Raider character skill, Retaliate. Now, before everybody freaks out about the placement of the skill and telling me how good it actually is, I know how good it is. I know how good it can be, but the thing is, part of the reason why it's so good is because of its passive ability. And yeah, in this video, we're just talking about the character skills, so I don't really want to rank it based on how it performs as a whole, because I haven't really talked about passive abilities for all the other characters, so it'd be pretty unfair if I just talked about it just for this one. Like, don't blame me, blame From Software for not like incorporating these into one skill and giving this guy a different passive ability. That's not my fault. I'm just making this video for fun anyway. It's not really meant to be taken seriously. But yeah, his passive ability is what makes him not get staggered out of the skill and what makes him not die in the skill as well, which is a pretty big portion as to what makes this really good. But it's pretty much impossible to talk about his skill without talking about the fact that you can't really get staggered out of it. So I'm still going to talk about it as a whole, but I'm not going to really rank it based on that. Like, I know it sounds pretty stupid, but it's my video. It's my list. Go make your own. Now, how this character skill actually works is that he does do this melee attack, like a stomping into headbutt combo. And this headbutt actually has a really large hitbox. It goes a lot further than you think. It sends enemies flying to the ground, does some decent stance damage. And throughout this animation, you do take a lot less damage. It's pretty much the equivalent of having Endure. And it also extends to the hyper armor value of it too. So you can pretty much just use this when you are trading out with enemies, or if you're trying to counter these like really annoying boss attacks or these boss combos that you aren't really too confident in dodging. You can pretty much just use this to like avoid it completely and just do damage in return. And the best thing about this is that there are relics out there that boost your damage every single time that you take damage, and it just synergizes perfectly with this skill because you just take next to no damage. And the thing is, when you are taking damage, you're benefiting the entire time, because when you do take roughly 850 damage, it does buff this particular skill to do like this fully charged effect. When your character gets all hot and steamy, the next time you use the skill, it does this like big palm blast AoE, makes it have like a larger hitbox, does a lot of damage, and most importantly, it actually staggers these larger bosses and these Night Lord bosses the exact same way an ultimate art would. Now, the downside of this is that it does have a very long animation, and sometimes you can just completely whiff with this thing. I kind of wish they gave us some more control over this to where we can be able to fully charge it when you want to if we do gain the buff, and not like force us to use it every single time we have it active. That'd be like the one thing that I would change about this, but other than that, it's pretty much a flawless skill. Number 3, we have the Revenant skill, Summon Spirit. Now, a lot of like Revenant's entire kit tends to get overlooked because people just look at her scalings, her lack of regenerating FP and her starting weapon, and tend to just ignore everything else she has going for her, because this particular skill in Summon Spirit is honestly amazing. Like, you get to summon enemies to fight for you. Now, the damage output for these particular enemies isn't going to be anything amazing, but it still is going to be some free passive damage on top of what you're doing. But the most important thing is that they're going to be taking aggro and actually stun locking enemies for you too. So in solo play, this gets lots of use because there are lots of incantations that you really want to use that have like these longer animations and you want to have them fully charged, and just throwing out your summons out there to stun lock or just take aggro so you can do that is incredibly invaluable. And even in teams as well, it's really good. You can't go wrong with just having another person out there just taking aggro, which just inherently keeps your other allies alive. But it definitely has a very high upside and a pretty high skill ceiling as well, because it has been pointed out to me somewhat recently that you can continuously spam the summon over and over over again, and it actually lets them attack a lot faster compared to if you just leave them out there the entire time by themselves. Now, I haven't really talked about the summons in particular, but Helen is kind of like the least useful one. Like, even though she can output the most amount of damage, she just dies in like 2 hits, but in return, she does have the quickest cooldown at only 1 minute. But the summons you will be alternating between the most would be Frederick and Sebastian, because they actually have an ample amount of health, and they still do some decent damage in return, especially after you use your ult to make them do their own version of their own ult. And there is a relic ability out there that gives you a damage boost every single time that you summon one of your allies, and depending on which one you summon will be dependent on which buff that you gain. Frederick gives you a 10% damage boost the entire time he's active, Sebastian gives you a damage negation boost, and Helen gives you some health regen. Like, my only gripe with the character skills is that it doesn't actually work with the character skill cooldown buffs at all in terms of how fast you can actually get your summons back. So if there was one thing I would change, it will be that. Adds to the restage skill, which is of the Duchess. This skill pretty much turns back time for the last few seconds and lets all enemies within close proximity pretty much just take 50% of the damage all over again. And it's not just going to be damage, but it also extends to status buildup and stance damage as well, which I don't think much else needs to be said. You can pretty much tell based on that statement alone about how powerful this thing can actually be in both solo play and in multiplayer. Like, any single time you see like a status effect get procced or someone do a critical attack or any high damaging attack, just click the button and just make it do a bunch more damage. And funnily enough, there's an entire relic ability that makes this particular skill even more powerful. It goes from 50% more damage to 60% more damage. And this thing only has a 12-second cooldown, and it's better than her ultimate ability. But another amazing thing about it that I didn't mention is that it doesn't require an animation at all. You can use it mid-attack combo, you can use it when you're taking damage yourself, you can use it mid-dodge. Like, it's quick, it's easy, and the benefit is just more damage. And that's number 1. We have the marking skill of the Iron Eye. This guy's going back to back getting number 1s in both the ultimate and the character skill. But yeah, the marking skill is probably the most broken thing to come out of this game, because it's pretty much an insane iframing dodge. It like lunges you in so far, covers so much distance, or you can like retreat really quickly so you actually can get in range to just spam your bows. And the fact that the entire animation just has iframes from start to finish is just insane. And the funny thing about this is that it actually does do damage as well and leave a debuff on enemies. Like, if it just had a dodge and just did damage, that would have been good enough for a skill. But no, it leaves a debuff on enemies to where if you or your allies actually damage the person that is marked, they just take 10% more damage. But it doesn't just stop there, because if you do enough damage, the mark actually explodes. And when the mark explodes, it just does a whole chunk of damage. It does a whole bunch of stance damage, and it also staggers all the enemies, like larger bosses, Night Lord bosses. They get staggered the exact same way that you stagger a boss with an ultimate attack. And it happens every single time that you just break the mark. And there also is other relic abilities out there that gives you a second charge of this. Why did they give a second charge to this ability? I will have no idea. And there's also another relic that lets you extend the duration of the mark, just in case you don't get to explode it in time, to guarantee that big boy broken damage and the big boy stance damage. Like, I have no idea what they were really thinking when they designed this character, but they needed to keep that same energy with the other ones too. Okay, but that's pretty much us now done with this one. As always, please do like and subscribe. The next video is probably going to be covering the passive abilities, ranking all of those from worst to best, and then probably end up talking more about things like relics and whatnot. So if those things do interest you, definitely do subscribe, and I'll catch you guys around. See yous!